In the early months of 1942, more than 110,000 Americans were removed from their homes by government order.
The Constitution and U.S. citizenship didn't mean much at that time as far as the U.S. government was concerned.
Surrounded by armed soldiers, they were forcibly detained, some for as long as 4 years. Yet no charges were ever filed.
We had no power, no political power to keep us out. And so, all we could do was just go in as we were ordered to do.
These people were of Japanese ancestry. 2/3 of them were American citizens. The United States was at war with the Empire of Japan. The justification given for the removal and incarceration, military necessity. The United States was also at war with Germany and Italy. Yet no American citizens of German or Italian ancestry were placed in camps without formal charges.
I think the only reason could be the racism that existed within our society.
In 1983, a special congressional commission completed an in-depth study of the wartime relocation and internment of civilians. Its conclusion stated that the causes were race prejudice, war hysteria, and the failure of political leadership. Many of the attitudes which led to the removal and internment of Japanese Americans had fully developed some 50 years before World War II ever began. In the early part of this century, anti-Asian prejudice became a powerful force permeating every level of society, business, and government on the American West Coast. Incidents of harassment, violence, and humiliation were not uncommon. Frank Nishio grew up in the Japanese section of Fresno, California.
Oh, in those days, the attitude towards Japanese Americans was very, very bad.
The United States Constitution establishes citizenship for all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Federal law prohibited Asian immigrants from being naturalized. This meant that the only way for a person of Japanese ancestry to become a citizen of the United States was to be born here. Various legislative efforts were launched to limit or end Asian immigration, to prevent job competition, and to segregate Japanese Americans from the rest of society. Izumi Taniguchi lived on a farm in Brentwood near Stockton, California.
The municipal swimming pools and so on were not open to Asians.
In Florin, California, Mary Tsukamoto was sent to a segregated public school.
And so there was always the feeling that we were second class, that we were not quite good enough to go to the school with the other children. And it was something you could never talk about. You just had a feeling about it.
Most labor unions prohibited Asian membership. To Japanese Americans, there were few options. They could own small businesses, fish, or run small farms. While few of these people ever became wealthy, a number of them did manage to succeed. Through hard work and sound practices, Japanese American farmers converted submarginal land into profitable growing areas. Many Caucasian farmers resented this competition and took steps to end it. In 1913, under pressure from farmers and other special interest groups, California passed a law making land ownership unlawful for any person ineligible for citizenship. Similar laws were passed in many other states. Many Asian immigrants continue to farm legally by purchasing land in the names of their American-born children. Anti-Asian, and particularly anti-Japanese racism, did one thing in addition to depriving a legitimate immigrant group of many of the opportunities other immigrants had enjoyed. It sold newspapers.
But if you are a majority, you don't think about the minority. You know, it's not in your everyday thinking. But if something happens, then you think about them.
William Randolph Hearst, a major American newspaper publisher, was not above printing an unjust story for his own purposes. His blatant exaggerations had helped precipitate the Spanish-American War in 1898. Less than 10 years later, the Hearst Press chose Japan and Japanese immigrants as its next target. Without a scrap of evidence, the papers ran stories foretelling of an imminent Japanese invasion. Many articles claimed Japanese immigrants had been secretly sent to act as spies and saboteurs. Unfounded though they were, these articles were yet another factor in the growing climate of racism regarding Japanese Americans. Yo Hosozawa lived in Los Angeles.
We used to have cars drive by and says, "Go back, you Japs." And here we're born in America, but my kids, naturally, they're raised over here, and they're born and raised and educated here, and they think, those things never happened, but they did happen.
Many groups and individuals campaigned for the end of Japanese immigration and for increasing controls on the Japanese American population.
So this was a frightening growing up time for all of us. This was always in our mind, that we were living in an atmosphere of a lot of hate and discrimination.
After intense pressure from the California Federation of Labor, the American Legion, the California Grange, and many other organizations, the Immigration Act of 1924 made it illegal for Japanese people to move to the United States. By the time the United States entered World War II, virtually every Japanese immigrant had been in this country a minimum of 17 years.
Nearly 2/3 of Japanese Americans had been born in this country and were, according to the Constitution, U.S. citizens, entitled to the same rights as all citizens. December 1941. The worst of the Great Depression was over. It was the age of swing, the era of the big band, of wide lapels, running boards, and Clark Gable movies. In Europe, Asia, and Africa, the war was raging, but not here. Mary Tsukamoto lived on a farm outside Sacramento with her husband and small child. She had attended college, but because of her race, was unable to pursue her career goal of becoming a teacher. She became active in church and community groups.
And so I was at the piano playing, and we had sung Joy to the World, and very innocently felt, as always, the time of coming of Christ's birth, the hope for peace and joy. Then in the middle of the church service, my husband ran in. He had been at home listening to the radio, and he was pale, and he shouted that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor.
The American public wept openly at the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. Anger, frustration, and pain cut into the hearts of all Americans. In San Jose, California, 10-year-old Norman Mineta was with his father when they learned of the attack.
And that was the first time I remembered ever seeing him cry, because he couldn't understand why the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor.
When the war began, many people understood the difference between the Japanese, who were our enemy, and Japanese Americans, who were in every way a part of this nation. All that would change in just 3 months.
In the months immediately following December 7, 1941, the Allied forces suffered a devastating series of defeats to the Empire of Japan. While military leaders knew it was tactically impossible, many Americans believed the long-feared Japanese invasion of the United States was at hand. An issue which was to become a major factor in the fate of Americans of Japanese ancestry was the unfounded belief that they would aid in a Japanese invasion if it ever came. This type of activity was referred to as Fifth Column. Navy Secretary Frank Knox.
I think the most effective fifth column work of the entire war was done in Hawaii, with the possible exception of Norway.
Secretary Knox's statement echoed a common misconception that Japanese Americans living in Hawaii had secretly aided in the Japanese attack.
California Governor Culbert Olson.
There are Japanese residents in California who have sought to aid the Japanese enemy by way of information or have shown indications of preparation for fifth column activities.
Every such allegation was investigated by government agencies, and found to be false. No acts of sabotage or espionage in the United States were ever found to have been committed by Japanese Americans. Yet the rumors continued.
California Attorney General Earl Warren.
The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken.
Sacramento Attorney Henry Takeda.
The whole country apparently was swept with the hysteria, well, hysteria born of bigotry and racism of the time.
Despite the pressures involved, government leaders knew there was no reason to treat Americans of Japanese ancestry differently from any other citizens. Months before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the Navy, concerned with growing tension in the Pacific, conducted an investigation to determine how Japanese Americans would react in the event of war. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Ringel traveled up and down the coast, met with hundreds of Japanese Americans, and even led a break-in of the Japanese consulate in Los Angeles. Commander Ringel concluded that the danger of espionage and sabotage was minimal, and that Japanese Americans should be treated individually rather than as a group. Despite this evidence, many government leaders were not satisfied. Within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack, the FBI began arresting selected Japanese immigrants and other enemy aliens. These included a number of Japanese immigrants who were prohibited from becoming American citizens. Edward J. Ennis of the U.S. Department of Justice was assigned responsibility for enemy aliens.
Oh, for months before, we had the FBI making up files on who might be dangerous, and we had lists of a couple of thousand Japanese, a couple of thousand Germans, a few Italians, a couple Hungarians, and I just gave orders or directions to pick them up.
Those suspected included business and community leaders, as well as anyone who might have connections to their native land. By law, enemy aliens are subject to arrest solely on the basis of their status. Evidence of subversive activities is not required.
I think the law is dated in 1798, and in all wars, except the Civil War, we intern civilians.
The law applies only to enemy aliens, not to American citizens. Within a week of the outbreak of war, the Justice Department was confident it had located and removed any potential spies. Its leaders openly stated that further action against Japanese Americans was unnecessary, and in the case of American citizens, unlawful. Other government leaders disagreed. California Congressman Leland Ford.
All Japanese, whether citizen or not, should be put in inland concentration camps.
I raised a constitutional question with the Attorney General of the United States and said that we must oppose this because it was unconstitutional. And he stated that if it were done by the military as an act of military necessity, it would not be unconstitutional.
A continuing rationalization throughout debates on the fate of Japanese Americans was the allegation of military necessity. Proponents of internment maintained that Japanese Americans represented potential danger to the American war effort, and that right or wrong, steps should be taken to deal with what they termed military necessity. There are three basic problems with this argument. It lumped people together on the basis of race and suggested that because there may be some danger from some members of an ethnic group, there was a potential danger from all of them. It suggested there may have been some reason to suspect Japanese Americans would be disloyal to this country, a contention for which no evidence has ever been found. And it implied that a given situation was more important than the guarantees of the Constitution. In essence, saying a war against the enemies of freedom was more important than the very freedoms which define this country. Assistant Secretary of War John J. McCloy.
If it is a question of the safety of the country and the Constitution, why, the Constitution is just a scrap of paper to me.
The War Department maintained that military necessity required removing all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. The press, including papers owned by Hearst, West Coast politicians, various growers' associations, and many of the same groups which had campaigned against Japanese immigration years before, called upon the federal government to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. The Justice Department, the Office of Naval Intelligence, and other agencies presented evidence that Japanese Americans were loyal and that any potentially dangerous people had been removed. The United States Constitution specifically forbade the government from depriving citizens of their liberty without due process of law. The final decision lay in the hands of one man. President Franklin Roosevelt would have to choose between racial and political pressures and the Constitution he had sworn to defend. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt, accepting the War Department's claim of military necessity, signed this document, Executive Order Number 9066.
Whereas the successful prosecution of the war requires every possible protection against espionage and against sabotage to national defense material, national defense premises.
While the document does not mention Japan or Japanese Americans, it gave the Secretary of War authority to exclude any or all persons from a military area and to provide those excluded with transportation, food, and shelter. None of the order's provisions were ever applied to any other group. A month later, Congress unanimously passed legislation providing criminal penalties for failing to comply with the executive order and appropriating funds. On March 29th, under the authority of Executive Order 9066, General John L. DeWitt, Chief of the Western Defense Command, restricted all people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast to within 5 miles of their homes. An 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. curfew was imposed on enemy aliens and all Japanese Americans. Immediately thereafter, DeWitt began issuing orders for Japanese Americans to report for what was termed evacuation. Norman Mineta remembers how he learned of the plans.
The Army started to post in very prominent places, telephone poles, sides of buildings, in front of just storefronts. Notices to all those of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien. And I can recall that because we weren't even considered citizens. We were non-aliens.
Euphemisms have always been an effective tool of repression. Calling something other than what it really is makes abuses easier to justify. Referring to citizens as non-aliens, or the uprooting of families as an evacuation, made it less apparent that these actions were in violation of the U.S. Constitution.
Jane Matsuoka was a high school student in Sacramento when she learned she would be placed in a camp.
And so when finally word came out that we were going to be put in, I could just remember the sense of outrage. I was really outraged and felt violated.
Henry Takeda.
Our young people will say, why didn't you barricade your home and fight it out? You know, it's easy to say these things, but when there's nobody standing beside you and fighting with you, and then you have a family and so forth, what are the answers? I don't know.
Most families were given 2 weeks or less to prepare.
We had to get rid of our personal possessions because we could only carry to camp what we could, in fact, carry. And there were a lot of people who were taking advantage of those situations by coming to your door and offering $5 for your refrigerator or $100 for your car. That may be valued much, much more.
My daughter was crying because she couldn't take her pet dog. And then Grandpa was silent as he looked out in the great vineyard. He had planted every vine, he had planted every tree on our yard. He had been here more than 50 years, and this was his place. And at 75, he was having to leave it. He had no idea whether he'd ever see it again.
Most of my classmates in high school just didn't know what happened to us. We just disappeared.
When we got on that bus at the backside of Memorial Auditorium in I think, latter part of April, I thought the whole world caved in on us. That was one time I broke down and cried.
I remember I had cried so hard I could hardly think, and I was so worn out and numb from the pain and the emotional experience of leaving our house and leaving our farm and leaving our friends and thinking finally we were losing our freedom.
In a relatively short time, over 110,000 Americans were removed from the West Coast. They had no idea where they were going or what would become of them. The United States Constitution clearly states that no person may be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. To put it another way, a person cannot be punished for a crime unless they have been proven guilty in a court of law. Yet in 1942, every man, woman, and child of Japanese ancestry living on the American West Coast was forcibly removed from his or her home on the grounds of military necessity, a charge which was not only unproven, but for which no evidence has ever been found. Despite the law, they did not receive individual hearings or any form of trial. This film was produced by the U.S. Government Office of War Information and portrayed events as the government wanted them to be seen.
Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued.
Mary Tsukamoto was taken by train to Fresno, where she and her family were transferred to what was termed an assembly center.
We were put on a cattle truck, you know, with partitions, and we had to stand up in it because we were packed like sardines standing up in a cattle truck.
Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons.
Dusty, dirty old brown barrack buildings in rows and a fence, and all the people that were aware that the train was going by was standing there hanging on to the fence and peeking out like trapped animals. And I said, gee, you know, I think that's the kind of place we're going to be going to.
The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all.
Yo Hosozawa was placed in the camp at Santa Anita.
They had some bad food, I guess, because everybody had the runs. And now in Santa Anita, we had a barrack full of toilets, which is maybe about, I'll say about 20 toilets with no partitions. They were all lined up. Can you imagine being in line with about 15, 20 people, and you had the runs.
These so-called assembly centers were only intended for temporary use. They were quickly constructed from cheap materials and designed with little regard to the physical, personal, and sanitary needs of so many people. San Francisco attorney James Purcell visited the temporary camps in San Bruno.
I was permitted to be escorted by a soldier to the residence of this client of mine. The residence was a cell. It was a stall, which had been accommodations for one horse. And was now the accommodations for a family. I remember distinctly that the horse manure was sticking to the walls and been whitewashed over.
In April 1942, a meeting of the Western governors was convened in Salt Lake City, Utah. Its purpose was to discuss the resettlement of Japanese Americans into normal lives in neighboring states. The governors had other feelings. Chase Clark, governor of Idaho.
The Japs live like rats, breed like rats, and act like rats. We don't want them buying or leasing land or becoming permanently located in our state.
Nels Smith, governor of Wyoming.
If you bring the Japanese into my state, I guarantee you they'll be hanging from every tree.
Any hopes of a smooth or fast resettlement were abandoned. It was determined that Japanese Americans would be housed in what amounted to prison camps under military guard, supervised by the Civilian War Relocation Authority. Government leaders chose to refer to these camps with the euphemism relocation centers. The American concentration camps.
Manzanar and Tule Lake, California. Gila River and Poston, Arizona. Heart Mountain, Wyoming. Topaz, Utah. Minidoka, Idaho. Amachi, Colorado. Rower and Jerome, Arkansas.
This is a model of the Manzanar camp in California's Owens Valley. A mile on each side, the facility housed more than 10,000 Japanese Americans. The entire facility was surrounded by a barbed wire fence and patrolled by armed guards. Around the perimeter were 8 towers in which soldiers sat behind machine guns. Each night, powerful searchlights would pass over the barracks buildings and sometimes follow people making their way to community latrines. Living conditions were similar in the other centers. This newsreel was prepared by the Army to tell soldiers overseas what was happening at home.
A caravan of Japanese-owned trucks and pleasure cars heads inland from the Pacific. Escorted by troopers, they go to make their homes under Uncle Sam's surveillance for the duration. Here in the land of Buffalo Bill, the government is erecting model camp towns, towns in which they'll live unmolested. Bathtubs, yes, all the comforts of home. The Japanese in America are finding Uncle Sam a loyal master despite the war.
That view of the camps is not shared by the people who were there. Frank Nishio was placed in a camp in Rower, Arkansas.
There was no running water or anything there. There were latrines and shower houses that were community.
Richard Tanaka was 10 years old when his family was incarcerated at Poston, Arizona.
It wasn't boys' camp. It wasn't fun for all type of thing. And we were told that if you moved out of this particular area, you may get shot.
Mary Tsukamoto and her family shared a single room.
And then the top was open so that you could hear voices from the neighbors, and they were shouting and fighting with each other. And we could hear the babies crying, and hear clear across this long barrack of 120 feet, the 5 to 6 families that were assigned to these barracks. We could hear their voices and realize that we had very little privacy in this place.
I was angered by the fact that we had to leave my friends and why we were being treated differently.
People were always saying that we were there in those camps for our protection. Well, if we were in those camps for our own protection, and we had those military guards and the guard towers there for our protection, well, why were the machine guns then pointed in at us?
I think it's difficult to imagine here you believe that this is your country and you're raised that way. You believe in American ideals and democracy as such, and all of a sudden you become a prisoner of war in a sense.
I just felt like our life was shortened by the experience we had, and that maybe we weren't going to live too long, and we worried about our daughter and all of that, you know, because we were psychologically at our lowest. We had hit the bottom of the barrel, and we just were really discouraged.
You always have that little hope. Even in your most despairing moment, you will maintain that hope that someday I will prove the government wrong.
Frustrated and without a public voice, Americans of Japanese ancestry were determined to have the rights to which they were entitled. Each person pursued this goal in his or her own way. The War Relocation Authority developed and distributed a questionnaire, the key components of which were two questions.
Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese Emperor, to any other foreign government, power, or organization?
Deprived of freedom without charge or evidence, Mary Tsukamoto found the questions deeply insulting.
I remember that. So we were outraged and incensed at the fact that the government decided to test us and threw at us the questionnaire a year after we had left our home.
Harry Iwafuchi felt he was part of this country and should support it.
For me, once I read it, I knew that it was yes, yes on both occasions.
Jane Matsuoka took a different view.
You know, it was very controversial what to do, and I had told my father I was going to do no, because I said my country doesn't want me, and you know, if that's the way, if I'm being treated in this way, then I don't want to profess that I would only have loyalty to one nation. And I guess I was still mad.
Most of those who answered no were deemed potentially disloyal and later placed in a segregation center, a camp converted to house them under tighter security. More than 5,000 people were so enraged at the continuing abuses, they lost faith in their own government and asked to renounce their U.S. citizenship. When, in 1944, the Army began drafting Japanese Americans from the camps, a small but determined group of men refused to go to war until the government restored their rights as citizens. Still loyal to the basic principles of American democracy, they were sentenced to federal penitentiaries. The way people chose to react to their situation was an intensely personal decision. Even though their basic rights had been denied, most residents continued to support the government. Henry Takeda was in the camp at Tule Lake.
We never pledged allegiance like we did in those days. Every meeting we had an American flag and we pledged allegiance before we sat down and started talking whatever the business of the gathering would be.
Here's another way Japanese Americans expressed themselves.
And here are American-born Japanese repaying that loyalty. Although their ancestors came from the land of the rising sun, these young Americans are volunteers in the U.S. Army, ready to fight and die defending America, the country of their birth.
The War Department authorized the creation of the 100th Battalion and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a combined military unit made up entirely of Japanese Americans. Tom Kawaguchi joined the 442nd from the camp at Topaz, Utah.
We were told right from the beginning that this was an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we were Americans, and at the same time, it became a challenge to all of us that in basic training, we try to beat all the records that existed, which we did.
Recruitment took place within the camps and in Hawaii. More than 25,000 proudly accepted the duty. Fighting in Italy and southern France, the unit liberated numerous cities and towns. In time, it became the single most decorated unit in military history for its size and length of service. Harry Iwafuchi remembers his battles in Europe.
You know, you're moving up and your comrades get hit and fall down by your side, and you can't stop to think about it. You just got to keep pushing because that's all that's in your mind, to capture the objective.
The loyalty and heroism of the 100th Infantry and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe did much to improve the public's perceptions of the Japanese Americans. However, unbeknownst to most Americans, thousands of other Japanese American soldiers quietly distinguished themselves fighting directly against the Japanese enemy. The Army Military Intelligence Service selected and trained volunteers for work in the Pacific, where they worked as frontline translators, reading captured enemy documents, interrogating prisoners, and encouraging enemy troops to surrender. In the words of one general, these soldiers shortened the war by at least 2 years. For Shig Doi, the sacrifices he and others made in battle were necessary not only for the war effort, but also for the nation to see that Japanese Americans were indeed a loyal and important part of America.
If it wasn't for the 100th and 442 sacrificing their lives, limbs, and everything, I think the whole situation would be completely different. So that's what I would like to have these people remember all this. Well, that's the reason why I go back to France to see my buddies that never did come back. That's the contribution. I hope they will never forget it.
In the United States, there are legal systems to challenge an unjust action or policy. Gordon Hirabayashi chose to disobey General DeWitt's orders and forced the government to defend its actions. He and his lawyers claimed the government had no right to impose a curfew or other restrictions on a group of people solely on the basis of race.
I thought they were crazy to even try to show that they would defy the government, that we wanted to tell everybody that we're so loyal, we'll obey. We felt that that was the right thing to do, and that by obeying and meekly submitting, that we were the more loyal people. But after 47 years, I'm really ashamed that I didn't have the courage to stand up and say way back in 1942 that I refuse.
In defending its actions, government lawyers claimed the orders were justified by military necessity, an expression still used by the government despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
The Supreme Court upheld the Hirabayashi conviction, ruling military necessity justified a curfew of all Japanese Americans.
Fred Korematsu chose not to report for evacuation and was arrested, tried, and found guilty of violating the orders. His lawyers appealed the conviction, claiming the evacuation and the incarceration it led to violated the due process clauses of the Constitution because they were based solely on racial origin. Historian and attorney Peter Irons has spent a number of years studying the Korematsu case.
That is, the government lawyers had argued to the Supreme Court that there was evidence that Japanese Americans had committed acts of espionage. This evidence came from General DeWitt's report on the internment. At the time the government made these arguments, they knew that there was no evidence to support those charges. In fact, that they'd all been investigated and found to be false. So the argument to the Supreme Court that espionage had been committed and therefore justified the internment was known to the government to be a lie.
In recent years, it has been discovered that DeWitt's report, upon which the government built its case, was altered by the War Department to ensure a victory in court. Edward Ennis of the Department of Justice.
And a revised report was made, and it was ordered that all copies of the original report be destroyed, and the colonel gave an affidavit saying he was present when they were all burned.
The court accepted the conclusions of DeWitt's report and voted 6-3 against Fred Korematsu. The decision stated that military necessity justified evacuating all Japanese Americans from the West Coast. The United States Constitution was designed with an inherent system of checks and balances to prevent abuses. The actions of each branch of government are checked by the others in accordance with the Constitution, the supreme law of the land.
Despite its obvious violation of the Fifth Amendment, the uprooting and forced evacuation of Japanese Americans had been initiated by the executive branch, approved by the legislative branch, and confirmed by the judicial branch. The safeguards of the Constitution had failed.
To me, the Constitution of the United States is a very sacred document, and I felt that this was an obligation as a lawyer to represent these people who were American citizens, and as such, in my opinion, entitled to the rights of any American citizen.
At the urging of the Japanese American community, civil rights attorney James Purcell developed his own test case.
We prepared and filed a questionnaire in the course of our preparation of this case. And we went through every questionnaire looking for the ideal petitioner.
Purcell selected Mitsui Endo, a former California state employee who spoke no Japanese, belonged to no Japanese organizations, and had a brother fighting in the military. His strategy was to show an example of a person who could not possibly be considered disloyal or dangerous, and demand that the government show just cause why she should not be released. In this case, the exclusion from the West Coast and initial confinement were not at issue, only the continued incarceration.
On December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court released its opinion in the Endo case, unanimously ruling that detaining admittedly loyal American citizens without charge was in violation of the U.S. Constitution.
I feel that the Endo case has definitively said that you can't incarcerate people beyond a reasonable time to investigate them where they are a legitimate suspect without colliding with the constitutional right of freedom.
In anticipation of the ruling in the Endo case, Army officials announced that they would no longer object to U.S. citizens whose loyalty was unquestioned returning to the West Coast. Resident aliens and people who had not answered yes, yes on their questionnaires were still excluded. For many, going home was yet another ordeal. Jane Matsuoka remembers.
My parents, moved all their household goods into a shed, and of course, while we were in camp then, everything was stolen.
After the return to the West Coast, everyone had to really rebuild their economic lives. They really had nothing after coming back from camp. Many had lost their farms, their businesses, their homes, and so they really essentially had to start from scratch.
After his discharge from the Army, Shig Doi returned to his small hometown in the Sierra foothills.
When I was a kid, I used to run around that town. Every store had No Japs Wanted. And that's the one that really took me back.
Richard Tanaka and his family were not welcomed back to San Jose.
This is the first group of immigrants that had to do things twice. That is to say that it was hard enough for them to come to the country, to make a living, to create some kind of nest state, give it all up, and start over again.
Even after reestablishing homes and incomes, there was much work to be done.
My mom and my dad lived here for about 40, 50 years over, and they couldn't become a citizens of the United States. And yet they had to give up their son to fight for the thing. I guess that's the reason why my folks there really died with a broken heart.
Americans of Japanese ancestry wanted, deserved, and fought to be as much of a part of American society as anyone else.
In 1952, after intense lobbying by members of the Japanese American community, Congress repealed the barriers to naturalization. Thousands of Japanese immigrants proudly took the oath as American citizens.
My mother immediately applied for citizenship, and she received it. She felt that she had a home, and that it was her home as well as ours.
After returning from camp, Norman Mineta grew up with memories that were never talked about.
And so over a long period of time, there's been a feeling of shame within the community of having this happen to them, because here their own government distrusted them, and despite the protections of the Constitution, the government abrogated those constitutional protections and placed everyone in camp.
For people to understand and learn from these events, there would have to be an official, unbiased investigation into exactly what happened and why. Today, Norman Mineta is a United States Congressman from San Jose.
So we put together legislation in 1980 to form the Commission on the Internment of Civilians, and so this occurred, and there was a year-and-a-half study.
The commission interviewed more than 750 witnesses. They received testimony from Japanese Americans who had been in the camps, from historians, sociologists, and from many of the leaders involved in the evacuation. The commission's findings were released in 1983.
The broad historical causes which shaped these decisions were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership.
They said, yes, there had been gross violation of the constitutional rights of Americans of Japanese ancestry, and that for those grievous errors, there should be redress.
Henry Takeda felt the government, like anyone else, must take responsibility for its actions.
What satisfaction am I supposed to get if the only thing that I can derive during my lifetime is for my government to say, I'm sorry, after 40 years?
Maybe we have to put a price tag on things that we do wrong. We do, our whole judiciary system is based on that. If someone is injured in an automobile accident, the person who caused the accident must pay the other person.
For more than 10 years, Japanese Americans, including many grown children of people who had been in the camps, fought for legislation that would hold the government accountable for its actions in violating the rights of American citizens.
In August of 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1988, awarding $20,000 tax-free to every survivor of the camps. In addition to financial compensation, the bill contained a public apology from the United States government for its actions.
George Matsuoka was also active in the redress campaign.
The thing that this redress bill has done for us, I believe, is that it demonstrates the capacity of a democratic government or democratic institutions to correct mistakes, and that's a significant thing.
In passing legislation and awarding compensation, the government has freely admitted it was wrong. The camps have sat empty for almost 50 years now. As time passes, the events which transpired here seem farther and farther away. What remains for us then is the future. And the question, could it ever happen again?
I think that it could happen again if we don't become aware of the fact that we need to protect civil rights for everybody.
Just in the last few years, there have been calls to put Cubans in camps, or Iranians in camps, or anybody from the Middle East. And I think that this is very dangerous.
You can't abrogate the rights of anybody. even in wartime, regardless of what the circumstances might be.
And I hope that the United States improves in its relationship with its citizens, and that the improvement be carried over to the relations of citizen to citizen, because that's where it starts.
I wouldn't want to be in any other country. I'm proud to be in this country and know that it has given me many opportunities and privileges and happiness that I would have never known. But I wanted to remember also the tears and humiliation and anguish and know that it could happen here. And I want to be sure it doesn't happen to anybody else.